Okay, everyone, let's continue with the second part of this webinar. Um, let's get back to where we left off. So here, um, remember these are the three phases of the construction of an execution context object. Here we have phase one, where the variable object construction occurs, and we have phase two, where the scope chain construction takes place. And finally, we have the this variable where the value of the this variable is set. So now that we have the variable object construction and the scope chain of the execution context, we have the this variable to capture all this. Okay, so we talked about what this variable is. Now let's see what its value is. So as you can see here, the value of this variable depends on where we are in the code. More specifically, if we're calling a normal function or we're calling a method which belongs to an object. So if we call a normal function, the value of this points to the global object. So if we're running client side, so if we're running our JavaScript client side, which means that we're in a browser environment, the value is the window object. So if we're running JavaScript outside of the browser, the value of this is the global object. So if we call a method on an object, this variable will point us to the object where the method is defined. So let's have a few words about what the window and the global object are. So essentially, if you're running wherever you're running um, the JavaScript code, you will uh, point. So if you log this without calling any function, you will get whatever the value of the outermost object is. So if you're running JavaScript on like Node.js, which is an environment outside of the browser, you will get the global object logged to you. If you log JavaScript in the browser and log actually this variable, you will get the window object, which is the outermost object in the browser. So um, the window object we have seen it in action. We have used it a lot of times, and we have a notion of what it is and what it represents. So that's what happens when you call a regular function. Those two values are going to get returned to you depending on where you're running your JavaScript. If you run it in a method, you will get the object that the method belongs to. So in the first example here, the value of this will be the global window object if you're running it in the browser. Remember that this will only be the case if you're running the code in Google Chrome, Safari, Mozilla, or any browser. If you're running it in another environment, let's say locally on our computer, we'll get the global object as a value returned when we call console log. In the second case here, where we have method call, um, firstly, we've defined an object. Its name is example. Uh, um, and it's stored in the example variable. This object has a single method called showThis, as you can see here, um, which simply logs the value of the this variable. So every time we call showThis, we will get what's um, the value of this is inside this method. So uh, That means that the value of this here will be the example object. I hope this is clear for you. So it's very important to understand this. We'll take a look at more examples later on to really drive this in. For now, let's move on to a really cool technique we can use. And that is method borrowing. And it's all about the value of the this variable. Here is kind of a definition of what method borrowing is. So in JavaScript, you can borrow methods from other objects to build some functionality without inheriting all the properties and methods of those objects. Let's have a quick imagination of a scenario. So imagine that you have two objects. In one of them, you have defined a method which at present you want to use on another one. So how can you use a method on an object knowing that this method belongs to another object altogether? So it turns out that in JavaScript, actually you can. So what this essentially means is that we can pick a single method from one object and use it with the properties and methods of a totally different object. And this variable will still point to the object that calls this method. Excuse me. This is sorry. This is very useful when we're refactoring our code to make it more reusable and concise. And here is an example of what method borrowing is in practice. We have a variable named bird that's kind of reminiscent to a class, but here it's just an object. Um, so the bird object stores a name property equal to lark and a do method that simply logs a message to the console making use of the name property. So here, notice how we're using the this variable here, right here, this dot name. So this is a reference to the bird objects, and we're getting the property name here. So we should see I'm a lark, I greet, and I greet. So greet here is not defined, it's a variable. We'll see what that happens later on. So um, if we were just to write name without the this keyword here, we'd get undefined and the code would not work. Also, the method accepts a parameter called greet here, right here in the function. So whatever you pass it here, it's going to be used here. After defining this object, we simply call it, and the first message we see in gray here in this black, I am a lark, I tweet. So here we called the bird object, it got its do method, and we passed in tweet. So we correctly got the this variable and accessed the name right here. And we simply use tweet here. So I am a lark, I tweet. So we got the correct output here. After that, we define a new object with butterfly, with the butterfly keyword, and that simply has a name property called swallowtail. And the final line we see here, right here, uh, is where the method borrowing process occurs. So we make use of a function called call, right here, this one, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. Remember, I said that these are very important functions or methods, and for now, let's focus on the output of the code. Once we do the method borrowing, we get what we would expect right here. I'm swallowtail, I flutter. Uh, by using method borrowing, we were able to reuse the bird object's method instead of writing the exact same method on the butterfly object as well. And that's essentially what method borrowing is. It's a technique um, which enables us to shorten our code and make it more concise. I encourage you to use this method or this technique as often as you can. And here it is, those three methods we were talking about earlier: bind, call, and apply. In the last example, we used only one of them, call, and we used method borrowing. First off, I want to mention uh, a few things about what the dry principle is. Um, I'm sure you've come across this concept a lot of times now. If you haven't, that's no problem. You'll get across it um, very nearly in time. Um, the dry principle, or simply the dry keyword here, it's a keyword. It's a abbreviation. Stands for "Don't repeat yourself." Uh, it is following this principle that sets apart good developers from really good ones. So anyone can write many functions that do exactly the same thing, but only great developers take the time to really take a look at their code and see if any functionality is replicated in two places or many more, and take their time to refactor um, and implement reusability in their code. Reusability is essential when we write our code, so make sure to always take it into account when you're writing any kind of code or any language: HTML, JavaScript, CSS, whatever it is. Right, now let's get back to the methods, knowing this dry principle. And I'll tell you that these three methods really help us follow this dry principle. So here you can see what the three methods are used for. They allow us to set the context of this variable. So in other words, bind, call, and apply are methods that allow us to control what the value of this variable is. So remember that we said that this variable gets its value only when a function is called, and it's completely automatic. That's so, or it's not actually automatic, but the process of what defines the value of this variable is hidden from us, and we don't have any control over it. But using these three methods allow us to set actually what this variable is equal to, or what its value is. This gives us huge control. Having the ability to choose the context that this variable gives us infinite possibilities to do all kinds of things, and most importantly, to make our code more reusable, as we just took a look at. So following the dry principle. So method borrowing makes heavy use of these three methods listed here: bind, call, and apply. All right, so let's go over each of them to get a bit better understanding of how they're used. Firstly, let's look at the call method. So we call this method on the object in which the method we're trying to get is defined. So we call it where the method is defined. What we should remember is that this method will be called immediately. So it's like calling a normal function. So we invoke the method. In addition, we must specify at least one argument in the call function's parentheses. This is the object we want to use the borrowed method on. So this object does not have this method. In addition to this, if the method expects any parameters, we should list them after the first argument. And here, in the end, we can see some example usage. We want to get the present method off of the John object. So there's a John object somewhere defined, and we want to use its method on another object. This other object is the first thing in the parentheses of the call function. So here, the Emily object. This is an object. Notice that it doesn't have any string operators or any quotes around it. So it's a variable that stores an object, the Emily object. Also, here the present method expects two parameters, which we've specified immediately after the Emily object, friendly and person. These are just strings used somewhere inside of the present method. And that's the call method in a nutshell. The apply method actually is exactly the same as the call method. The only difference between the two is that if there are any arguments we want to pass to the borrowed method, so in our case, friendly and person, we have to put them in an array. Here, notice how friendly and person are inside of an array. This is useful actually when there are lots of parameters. So we can store them in a variable, which is an array, and just simply pass the array in the apply function and not just simply list tens of parameters. Other than that, so there's absolutely no difference, and you can use whichever method is more convenient. Also notice that this function gets called immediately as well, just like the call method. Believe it or not, the bind method is almost the same as the previous two. Actually, it's the same as the call method. The only difference, again, there's just one tiny but very essential difference. And that difference is that this method does not call the function immediately. We use the bind method only to store the method on our desired object or variable for future use. Notice how in the example here, we define a John friendly variable, and we set it equal to whatever is returned from the bind function. This variable is a function now because it gets set to whatever the present function is with these variables and the new object. And it's there for us if we ever need it in the future. So these three methods essentially give us control over what this variable value is. Here, we use the bind method to store it for future use, and we use either one of call and apply if we want to immediately invoke the function. And actually, that's all the theory I wanted to show you for this week. Let's go through the resources quickly so we can see a few examples. First up, we have the MDN documentation on this variable. In this link, you will also find in-depth explanations on method borrowing and the three methods we just explained. The next one, so the second one, is an article on Medium for this variable. I put it just in case you find the explanation on MDN a bit overwhelming. This article is written in pretty plain and easy to understand words, so definitely check that out. Um, in third place, we have another Medium article, this time about method borrowing. Here there are many examples of method borrowing in different contexts, and hopefully you can reference them whenever you're trying to implement this technique. And finally, you have a bit of explanations on the bind, call, and apply methods. Also, in this link, there are exercises for you to test your knowledge of the three methods. So be sure to go over there and try your hand at those exercises. And that's it for the presentation, actually. We covered a lot of topics that are not that easy to understand at first. Hopefully, your understanding of how JavaScript works and how it defines this variable seems a bit clearer now. Um, Starting out with JavaScript can be a bit difficult because all these topics and concepts are not obvious at first, but once you get the hang of these concepts we looked at in the previous weeks, like scope, chain, the execution stack, and event loop, and combine them with the knowledge of what this variable is, the haze around how JavaScript works starts to disappear really quickly. So knowing all this, let's see a bit of code to make sense of all this. So remember, I will um, share the presentation with you after we complete the coding examples. I'm just really quickly going to start the new code editor. I use Visual Studio Code um, because it's all the craze right now. Um, just simply uh, a bit of time before it starts. Lower the project directory where I created these. First, let's go over these ones. And here, my HTML file is nothing simply. It's just a white screen. I've just linked the external JavaScript file, so we don't have to memorize anything in here. And here is what's interesting. So first off, we're starting off by just simply logging what this variable is. And let's actually see what the result of this code will be. Opening the console, DevTools, and here you can see the result of the code. We get the window object. As you may remember, just simply logging this gives us the window object. We know what that is, so let's move on to the next example. Let's comment out this part of the code and uncomment this right here. So it's the calculate age function. It takes in a year of birth and logs what the age is. And after that, we will see what this variable points to inside a function call. So say this, refresh the browser, and we see 34. That's because um, we called calculate age with 1984. Right now, we use this bit of code to get what the current year is. So it's 2019 minus 1985 equals 34. And what's more interesting here is that by logging this inside a normal function call, we get the window object returned again. And that's essentially what this bit of code does. And now let's see, by defining an object called John. So this object just has a year of birth, 1985 again, and it has a method, calculate age, which is the same as the one you see here. The current year is again gotten by this piece of code, so it's 2019. It's exactly the same. However, inside the method, there's a definition of an inner function. So let's remove that for now, and let's see what this variable points to inside here. So here we call this method, so calculate age. So it should be 34 again, and let's see. Yes, there it is, 34. But this time we get a reference to the John object. So here, the calculate age method and the year of birth. This is the John object. That's why. So that's a demonstration of why this variable points to the object it's defined in. Now let's throw in an inner function that simply console logs this and call it whenever the calculate age method is called. So let's see what this variable will be. And right here we get the same logs, but this time we get a reference to the window object. And remember that we're inside a method of an object. So this happens right here, that this variable is the global object, because remember that whenever we do a normal function call, this variable points to the window object, and that's not different when you're inside a method. So this can get a bit confusing, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it. Just if you normalize that, every time you call a normal function that this variable points to the window object, you will have no surprises like this one. So after defining this object, John, let's define another one called Mike. And it just has the name and the year of birth. So it's 1983. He's 2 years older. Now here we assign the calculate age method of the Mike object to whatever the calculate age method of the John object is. And here we call it. So let's see if we will have any success with that. So we should have the calculate age method right here pointing to exactly what this is. So let's see if we get the desired effect. And yes, as you can see here, that this variable worked correctly, and it put 1983 in the calculate age method and not 1985. So this is a graphical representation of method borrowing that we saw. So these are a bit, this is not a very good way to do method borrowing. It is, however, a way, and I wanted to show you. Now let's see a bit more sophisticated way of doing method borrowing with the three methods we saw a bit earlier. So the bind, call, and apply methods. Remember that we used them to get the power to assign whatever the this variable we want, whatever the value of the this variable should be. So right here we have a John object. It has a name of John Smith, an age of 26, and the job as a teacher. And it has a presentation actually method that accepts two variables, style and time of day. So depending, here we have this if and else if statements that check what the style is. So if the style is formal, John is going to introduce himself formally. So good, whatever the time of day is, here the time of day is used. This is, by the way, an ES6 feature, the backticks. That's called template literals. It's a very handy feature. Instead of writing all these plus signs and these strings and variable names, you can just write the thing out between the backticks and include the $sign and the curly braces wherever you have a variable. So um, we have the presentation method, and it checks whatever the style is and spits out a log to the console. So let's try it out. Let's try casual and morning. So it should go in this statement here. Um, it should say how's it going. It should say I am John Smith and I'm a teacher and I'm 26 years old and good morning. So that's the casual way of doing things. Let me just open the index HTML file for this code snippet. There it is. Open the DevTools again. Make sure we see what's going on. And there the console is. There is the console. Okay, how's it going? I'm John Smith. I'm a teacher and I'm 26 years old. Good morning. So that worked. Our presentation method works correctly. Now, if we define an Emily object and put just the name, the age, and the job, we would do nothing at all. So, on the other hand, if we use the call method, remember it calls the function immediately. So the function inside the method, and remember we pass in the object that we want that doesn't have the method we want to use. And after that, we specify all the parameters we need. So here formal and after new. Let's test out the first if statement to check if it's gonna work. Oops. There we go. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Emily and I'm a developer. I'm 35 years old. So that worked. So this variable, so the presentation method gets signed to the Emily object. And that's how the call method works. Remember that apply is exactly the same, just we have to put these the parameters into parentheses. We're not gonna take a look at this one because just doing this does nothing. And we'll move on straightly to the bind method function. Remember that using the bind method does not immediately call the function. So we must first store it inside a variable, and we do just that here with John Casual. And now, after doing this here, we should get, let's actually define another string here. I forgot to put the string of the date of the time of day. Let's put it to morning again. Or actually, let's get evening because right now we're in the evening. And right now, the John Casual is a variable that holds a function. Let's call, actually, we can skip this here. And Here we put the next parameter, and let's call the jump casual function to see what happens. And here we get what we decide and what we want to happen. Hey, how's it going? I'm John Smith. I'm a teacher and I'm 26 years old. So we bound the John object to the John. That's not what we wanted to do here. So let's call it on Emily as well. And there we go. I'm Emily. I'm a developer and I'm 35 years old. Good morning. Okay. Let's try it with night. Let's see if Emily will say that good night. And there we go. Good night. So that's how we use the bind function. Let's actually test out the formal case. So notice here that we had casual. Let's do formal. Just simply call the function here, the new one, Emily formal, and let's call it with afternoon. So good afternoon. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Emily and I'm a developer. I'm 35 years old. So everything worked correctly. This variable was set correctly to the Emily object, and we used formal and afternoon as well. And that's actually all the examples I wanted to show you. Um, Hopefully, you got some knowledge out of this. All the slides of the presentation and all the coding examples, I will share them with you. If not tonight, tomorrow, whenever the video on YouTube gets rendered. And I want to thank you for attending this webinar. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to message me at any time on Slack. Feel free to leave any suggestions for any resources you might want me to share with you. Good luck with the project. I'm rooting for you. You can do this. And that's it from me for this week. We'll see each other next week with another topic. I'm going to share with you what it will be. And have a good night. That's it for me. Hello.